The door I remember best is the one that closed behind me, and it closed soft, which was the cruelty of it, because a thing slammed can be argued with, and a thing latched quiet cannot. It was the 2nd of October, 1886, on the high benchland above the sweet grass country in Montana Territory, and I was 19 years old and married 4 years to a man named Royce Pell, who had decided sometime over the summer that a wife who could not give him a living child was a debt he would rather not carry through another winter. He did not strike me. He set my trunk on the wagon step and read the thing he had practiced, that the homestead was filed in his name and his brother's, that there was no place in it for me, and that the decent thing was for me to go to town before the snow. I had a quilt, a tin of seed, my father's leather roll of tools, and a brown dog named Captain who would not stay when I told him to stay. The benchland ran out flat and gray in every direction, and the wind came across it the way a collector comes up a lane, unhurried, certain it will be paid. Stay with me, because the cold that was coming that year would settle a question the whole valley had decided it already, knew the answer to. They had decided about me the day my trunk hit the wagon step, and the label was fastened before the wheels stopped turning, and what I did not yet understand, standing there with my hand on Captain's warm head, was that the ground they thought had cursed me was the only thing in that country that would keep its word. I went, but I did not go to town. I went down the coulee to the quarter section. Nobody had proved up, the one the men called the slump, because the bench shed its rainwater there, and the grass grew rank, and the clay lay close under the sod, and I stood in that low, wet ground with my father's tools, and began very slowly to understand what he had left me. My father was a man named Alban Rear, a Cornish stonemason, who had crossed over young and drifted west building chimneys and root cellars and the stone footings of other men's barns, and he died of a lung sickness when I was 16, leaving me no money at all and a head full of the only thing he ever called worth having. He was not a warm man in his words, but he was a warm man in his teaching, and the difference took me years to understand. He would stand me at the foot of a wall he was laying and make me put my hand on it at noon and again at dark, so I would feel for myself how the stone he had set in the morning held the day's sun into the night, and he would say nothing while I felt it, only watch my face until he saw the understanding arrive. He used to say that the only inheritance that does not spoil is the kind that lives in the hands, and he said it not as a comfort but as a plain fact, the way he would tell me the dew point or the set of a flue. He had grown up in a country of stone and rain where men had banked their houses into the green hillsides for longer than anyone could count, and he carried that knowing across an ocean and half a continent the way another man carries a watch. He taught me how earth holds heat, not as a notion, but as a thing I could measure with the flat of my hand against a cellar wall, while the frost stood white in the yard above. He taught me that a wall of turf laid grass down and grass up, course on course, breathes and binds and does not burn, and that stone behind it will take the warmth of a small fire all day and give it back all night the way a body gives back the warmth of a bed. He taught me that the cold is not a thing that comes in, so much as a thing the warmth leaks out to meet, and that a house is only the argument you make against that leaking, and that most men make the argument out of boards an inch thick and then wonder why the cold wins it. He had built us a thing like it once, a half-buried byre on a Welsh hillside before he ever saw this country, and he drew it for me in the dirt more times than I can count. The bank cut into the slope, the stone lining, the turf skin, the low door faced away from the weather, the flue drawing thin and steady. I had thought, when he died, that he had left me nothing I could use. I had married Royce that next spring because a girl with no money and no people marries the first steady offer, and I had spent 4 years learning that a steady offer is not the same as a kind one. Now I stood in the slump with the wind reading its account over my shoulder, and I knelt and cut a square of sod with my father's turfing iron and turned it over and saw the roots laced thick as felt, and I understood that he had left me a house. I just had to dig it out of the ground he had taught me to read. The clay was the thing the valley hated, and the thing I wanted. Wet clay slumps and heaves and will not grow a decent crop, and every man on the bench had passed that quarter and called it spoiled. But clay packed and faced with stone is a wall that will not let the cold through, and the slope of the coulee gave me a south bank, already half cut by the runoff, a place to set my back against the hill and let the earth carry 3 sides of my house before I laid a single course. My father had taught me to read a slope the way other people read a face, to see where the water had gone and what it had left, and where the bench shed its rain into that low ground it had carried the fine clay down, and laid it in a band a man could have cut with a spade and rolled like dough. I marked the house on the first week with stakes and a string I rubbed with charcoal so the line would show, 12 feet by 16, the long axis east and west, so the low door opened east away from the northwest wind, and I set the back wall hard against the deepest cut of the bank, so that the hill itself would stand for 3 sides, and most of a fourth, and I would have only the south face and the door to build up out of nothing. Then I began to dig. The first day, I made a hole you could have hidden a dog in. The second day, my shoulders seized so hard in the night that I wept into Captain's coat, not from sorrow, but from the plain animal misery of the muscle, and in the morning I dug again, because a body that is made to work softens or it hardens, and I had decided which. Captain dug beside me for the joy of it, and undid as much as he helped, throwing clay between his legs in a brown spray, and at night he lay against my back under the wagon sheet I had stretched on poles, and his warmth was the only argument I had that I had not made a terrible mistake. I cut into the bank a foot at a time, squaring the floor with a level my father had made me from a straight stick and a string and a stone, and I hauled the broken stone up out of the coulee where the spring floods had quarried it for me, and left it in slabs along the wash, sledding the big ones up the slope on the same wagon sheet, 100 trips, 200, until the path I wore was packed hard as a road. My hands cracked and bled and healed into something harder, and the blood I left on the stone that fall is in those walls yet, which is a thing I have never minded. By the middle of October, I had a hole in the hill that a passing rider would have taken for a grave, and that is very near what they took it for. The first of them to put a word to it was a man named Dyer Holt, who ran cattle on the bench above and considered himself the sense of the valley because he had the most of it under fence. He came down the coulee on his good gray horse one afternoon, while I was setting the first course of stone, and he sat the horse and watched me work a while, and then he said it was a sorry thing to see a young woman digging her own hole in the ground, and that there was charity in town for women in my condition, and that I ought to take it before I shamed the whole district. I told him I was not in any condition but cold, and that I meant to fix that before the snow. He looked at the stone and the clay and the brown dog and the stretched wagon sheet, and something settled in his face that was almost pity and was mostly contempt, and he said the word that would follow me all that fall. He called it the Badger Den. He said it loud enough that the 2 riders with him laughed, and he said a badger at least had the sense to be born knowing how. And he turned the gray and went back up the coulee, and the name went up with him and was all over the bench by Sunday. They called me the Badger Woman in the store and at the church social and on every porch from the creek to the rim, and I have wondered since whether a man knows, when he hangs a name on a person, that he is also hanging it on himself to be read back to him later in a colder season. I laid stone through the end of October and into November, and the work taught me what my father's drawings could not. I learned that a wall of dry-laid stone wants its weight carried down and in. Each course tilted a hair toward the hill, so the whole face leaned its load into the bank, and I learned to choose the slabs by ear, tapping them with a smaller stone and listening for the dull true note that meant no hidden crack. A stone that rang clear had a flaw running through it and would split with the first hard freeze, and a stone that answered dull and low was sound, and I learned to trust my ear over my eye, which is a thing my father had told me, and which I had not believed until the stones themselves taught me he was right. Behind the stone I packed clay, wet and tamped in lifts no thicker than my hand, kneeling to drive it down with a wooden maul until it took the print of nothing and gave back the weight of everything. And over the clay, where the wall rose above the cut of the bank, I laid the turf my father had taught me to lay. Grass down on the first course to bind, grass up on the next to grow, course on course, so the living roots would knit the whole skin into one breathing hide by spring. I cut the sods from the high dry ground, where the grass was the toughest, slicing them a hand deep and a forearm long with the turfing iron and stacking them like loaves, and Captain carried the small ones in his mouth as if he had decided this was his work too, and I set them. For the roof I felled lodgepole in the draw and laid the poles close and tight from the stone wall to a ridge beam I had sweated up the slope on. Rollers, and over the poles I laid brush, and then a foot of turf, sloped to shed, so that from above my house would be a low green swell in the hillside, with smoke rising from it, and nothing more. The peak of the mocking came at the church social, in the second week of November, in the schoolhouse on the creek, where the valley gathered to eat and to measure one another. I had walked the 3 miles in, because a person alone needs to stand among people now and again, even when the people have decided what she is, and I took my plate and sat at the end of a bench, and the talk moved around me, the way water moves around a stone it has decided not to bother with. Dyer Holt was there with his wife and his fine coat, and he was telling the men by the stove about the strange business down in the slump, and he did not lower his voice, because the cruelty of a confident man is that he does not think to. He said, a young woman had gone to ground like a varmint rather than take honest charity, and he said the county would be digging her out frozen come spring, and he called it the Badger Den again, there in the warm schoolhouse with everyone to hear. And the men laughed, and a woman near me clicked her tongue and said it was a pity. One person spoke for me, a widow named Esther Cobb, who had buried 2 husbands and a deal of her softness, said from across the room that she had seen the Welsh and the Cornish bank their houses into the hills, and that there was older sense in it than in any frame shanty on the bench, and she was overruled by the laughter the way a single true note is overruled by a loud room, and she caught my eye and held it a moment, and I have not forgotten her. I left before the singing. I walked the 3 miles home under a sky already hardening toward the cold that was coming, and I went down into my warm, dark house and put my hand on the stone, and the stone did not laugh. I left one thing unexplained to anyone who asked, and Dyer Holt asked, riding by in November with the first hard frost whitening the grass. He wanted to know why I had built my flue the way I had, the stone throat narrow and the draft hole low on the windward side, where a sensible person would have wanted no hole at all. I told him my father had taught me that a fire needs to be fed low and slow, that a wide flue robs a small fire of its heat and sends it up the pipe, and that the low draw hole would pull air across the coals even when the snow had packed the door. He said it was a wonder I did not just gather acorns and be done with it. And he called it the Badger Den one last time, the snow already spitting out of the north behind his words, and he rode on. I want to tell you about the night my father's principles stopped being words. It was the last week of November, a still cold settling night, and I had finished the door at last, a low thick slab of plank, faced with a second skin of turf-stuffed hide and hung to swing inward and seal. Against a stone lintel, I lit my first real fire in the small stone hearth at the back of the house, fed it low the way he had taught me, and I sat on the packed clay floor with Captain against my leg and watched the warmth come up out of the stone. The walls did not sweat. The air did not foul. The thin flue drew a steady thread of smoke, and the low hole on the windward side pulled a cold breath across the coals so they glowed without my feeding them. And by midnight the little room held a warmth that had nothing to do with the size of the fire and everything to do with the weight of earth and stone around it. I had not felt warm in 4 years of Royce Pell's house, where the wind came through the chinking, and the stove ate cordwood by the rick and gave back nothing past the length of your arm. Here the heat lived in the walls. I put my hand flat on the stone behind the hearth and felt it warm as a loaf, and I understood the thing my father had told me 100 times, that earth is the slowest and the most faithful of all the things that hold a fire, and I understood it not as a fact now, but as a feeling, which is the only way a body ever truly learns a thing. The feeling came first. The words I had carried for years, the warmth I earned that night. I sat there past midnight not wanting to sleep because I had been cold so long that being warm felt like a country I had been exiled from and only now allowed back into, and I wanted to stay awake at its border a while. Captain stretched and sighed and rolled to put his belly to the fire. The clay floor under me held the warmth, too, and the seed potatoes banked along the wall did not freeze, and the one small window of oiled hide glowed amber from inside against the black cold pressing on it from without. I thought of Royce Pell's house with the wind and the chinking, and the stove that ate a rick a week and gave back the length of an arm, and I did not think of it with bitterness, only with a kind of wonder that men will spend their whole lives fighting the cold with the one weapon that cannot win, and never think to set their backs against the hill instead. My father had set his back against the hill on the far side of an ocean. I had carried the lesson without knowing I held it, the way you carry your own heartbeat. And here in the dark it had finally spoken. December came in with a sky the color of a skinned thing, and the valley filled with talk that was not about me, because the cattlemen had begun to worry. Dyer Holt and the others had wintered easy for 3 years running, and had let their hay go thin and their woodpiles go short, trusting the Chinooks to come down off the mountains and open the grass the way they had. The old crow who cut wood for the store told anyone who would listen that the muskrats had built their houses high, and the antelope had gone south early, and the winter would be a hard one, and the men laughed at him, the way they laughed at me, because the comfort of the crowd is the last thing a confident man will set down. There is a kind of man who mistakes 3 lucky winters for a law of nature, and the bench was full of them that year, and they had built their lives on boards and on luck and called it sense. The first storm came on the 8th of December and laid a foot of snow, and the Chinook did not come behind it. The second came on the 14th, and the cold came down behind that one and did not lift, a still hard cold that cracked the cottonwoods along the creek with a sound like shots in the night. I counted my stores the way my father had taught me to count anything I would have to live on by what I had and not by what I hoped. I had filled my house by then. I had 3 cords of split lodgepole stacked in a stone lean-to against the door wall, a barrel of frozen meat, a loft of hay for the one cow I had bought lean and cheap in October, and seed potatoes and turnips banked in clay along the warm wall where they would not freeze, and a sack of beans and a sack of meal and a crock of rendered fat that would carry me to a thaw whenever the thaw decided to come. Up on the bench, by what I could see of the smoke and later learned for certain, Dyer Holt had wood for a month of ordinary weather and was burning it against weather that was not ordinary. And the Sairn family 2 miles east had less, and the young Telford couple who had filed that spring, had a sod-roofed claim shanty and a single rick of green cottonwood that would hiss more than it burned. Captain lay by the hearth and grew a coat like a bear. I waited, and the bench above me went quiet, and the smoke from the home places rose thin where it rose at all, and then on some of them it stopped rising, and I marked which ones in my mind without yet letting myself understand what a stopped chimney meant in that cold. On the night of the 11th of January, the great cold came, the one the territory papers would later set at 51 degrees below in the sweet grass country, the one that killed cattle by the tens of thousands across Montana that winter and broke the open range men for good, and it came with a wind out of the northwest that drove the snow flat and filled the coulees to their rims. I had brought the cow inside the lean-to and barred it. I sat in my warm house with my hand on Captain's back and listened to the wind go over the turf roof the way water goes over a stone, finding no edge to lift, no corner to pry, nothing to take. The low draw hole pulled its cold thread across the coals, and the stone gave back its warmth, and the air stayed sweet, and I slept. I want you to understand that plainly, because it was the whole of the thing my father left me. While the valley froze, I slept. I woke and fed the fire low and slept again, and the snow packed the door against its stone lintel and sealed me in warmth. And the only cold that reached me was the cold I let in when I cracked the door at dawn to see what the night had done. What it had done was bury the world. The drifts had risen to the eaves of the home places on the bench, and the cattle stood dead in the lee of the picket fences where they had drifted and frozen on their feet, and the smoke that should have risen from a dozen chimneys did not rise from most. I would have stayed in my warm hole and let the valley settle its own account, except that on the morning of the 13th, I heard a sound under the wind that was not the wind, a thin animal sound that was a child crying, and I dug up out of my door into a white blind world and followed it along the buried fence line to the Holt place a half-mile up the bench. What I found there I will tell you so simply, because it does not want decorating. Dyer Holt had burned his woodpile down to splinters by the second week and had begun feeding the fence rails and then the furniture to a stove that gave back nothing, and the cold had come through his frame walls the way it comes through a coat, and he and his wife and their two small children had crowded into one bed under every quilt in the house and had stopped being able to get warm. The boy was the one crying. The others were past it. I got the door open against the drift and I stood in that frozen room, and Dyer Holt looked up at me from the bed with his beard white with his own breath, and I saw him understand, in the space of a single breath, every word he had said on the rim road. He did not say he was sorry. There was no time and no warmth for sorry. I said the only thing the moment had room for. I said, "Bring the children. The badger den is warm," and he came. It took 2 trips through that wind with Captain breaking trail ahead of me, and the children wrapped to my body, and it took the last of my strength to get the 4 of them down into my house and packed close around the hearth. And then I went back a 3rd time for the wife, who could not walk, and I carried her on a sledge I had lashed from 2 poles in the wagon sheet, the dog hauling at the front of it with a rope in his teeth as if he had been bred for nothing else. When I had them all inside and the door sealed, my 12 by 16 room held 6 people and a dog and a fire no bigger than a wash basin, and the stone gave its warmth back to all of us without complaint, because warmth held in earth does not care how many it warms. I banked the fire low, and the air stayed sweet through the low draw hole, and the children stopped shivering by dark. And Dyer Holt sat with his back against my father's stone and put his hand flat on the wall the way I had the first night, and felt it warm as a loaf. He took his hand away and looked at it. Then he looked at the turf and the stone and the close-laid poles overhead, and he was quiet a long while, the kind of quiet a proud man pays out slow. And then he said it low, not to me so much as to the wall. He said, You built it to hold the heat the ground gives back. That was all. 5 plain words of recognition, and they cost him more than the cattle he had lost. And I did not answer them, because the warmth in the stone was answering for me, and a thing once understood does not need to be agreed to out loud. The fire ticked low in its hearth. Outside, the wind went on, over the roof, finding nothing to take. And inside, the 2 children slept against their mother in the warmth my father had taught me how to keep. And Dyer Holt sat with his back to the stone and his eyes open in the dark, a man learning, at 40 years of age, and at the cost of nearly everything, the one thing he had laughed at a young woman for knowing. I let him sit. I had no use for his shame and no wish to add to it, and I think he understood that too, in time, that the woman he had named the Badger had more grace in her than he had shown her, and that this, more than the warm stone, was the thing that humbled him for good. The wall held its heat. Nobody spoke again until morning. We were 11 days in that house before the cold broke and a man could move on the bench again. 11 days on my 3 cords and my barrel of meat and my banked turnips, 6 people and a cow and a dog kept alive by a fire you could have cupped in your hands. When the Chinook finally came down off the mountains on the 24th and the eaves began to drip, Dyer Holt dug us out and stood in the wet light, blinking at a valley scattered with the dark shapes of dead stock as far as the rim. His own herd gone, the open-range fortune he had wintered so carelessly lying frozen in the coulees, and behind him my low green house, breathing its thread of smoke as it had all winter, untouched. He had come into that winter the richest man on the bench and the surest, and he came out of it with his children alive, and almost nothing else. And the 2 facts sat in him together for the rest of his life, and made him of all things my first and most stubborn student. Because a man humbled clean does not stay on the ground. He gets up and learns the thing that put him there. The spring brought the surveyor, a young man named Pell, that the county sent to settle the proving-up claims after the winter killed so many off their land. No kin to Royce that I ever learned, just a name that startled me the once, and then was only itself. He rode to the bench with his chains and his field book, and when he came to my quarter, he sat his horse a long time, looking at the green-roofed house, set into the south bank with the cow grazing the new grass on its very roof, and he got down and asked if he might see how it was made. I showed him. The stone leaned into the hill, and the clay packed in lifts, and the turf laid grass down and grass up, and the narrow flue and the low draw hole, and the door faced away from the weather, and he wrote it all in his field book in a careful hand, and drew the section of the wall, the way my father used to draw it in the dirt. He said he had seen 40 homesteads that winter, where the people had died in good frame houses, with the wind coming through the walls, and that he had not seen one earth-banked house where anyone had been lost. He asked me where I had learned it. I told him my father had left it to me, that he had been a Cornish mason and had left me no money, and this instead, and that the only inheritance worth having is the kind a winter cannot freeze and a man cannot take off your wagon and read you out of. He wrote that down too, though I had not meant it for his book. The method went out from that quarter, the way water goes out from a spring, slow and certain and downhill. Dyer Holt built the first copy that next summer, banking a new house into the rim where his frame house had stood, and he got it wrong the first time, laying his turf grass up all the way and watching it slump in the first rain, until he came down the coulee and asked me plain how it bound, and I told him grass down to knit and grass up to grow, and he did it right the second time, and his house stood. That was the lesson under the lesson, the one the surveyor's book could carry, but the copying could not. The form was easy to steal, and the principle was not. The young Telford couple who had nearly died in their claim shanty came next, and they came not to look but to ask, having learned the cost of looking. And I went up myself and stood in their cut, and showed the wife how to read the slope for the clay, and showed the husband how to tap a stone and listen for the dull true note, and their house went up sound and warm and stands today with their grandchildren in it. The neighbors who built from looking, who saw the green roof and the low door and thought the look of the thing was the whole of it, built houses that sweated and smoked and slumped, and they came one by one down to the slump to ask the badger woman how it was truly done, and the name changed in their mouths while they asked, the way a name does when the thing it was meant to mock turns out to be the thing that saves your children. Esther Cobb, the widow who had spoken for me in the schoolhouse, was the second to build, and she said, when her house was finished, that she had waited 30 years to see good sense win an argument in that valley, and had nearly given up. By the third winter, there were 9 earth-banked houses on the sweet grass bench, and not a soul lost in any of them, and the young surveyor's section drawing had gone into a county report, and from there, I am told, into a territorial pamphlet on winter building that traveled further than I ever did, into camps and homesteads in countries I will never see, carrying my father's hands in a careful stranger's drawing. I lived in that house 51 years. I never married again and never wanted to, and I never bore a child. And the thing that had been read to me on a wagon step as the sum of my worthlessness turned out to be the smallest fact about my life. I took in 2 orphan girls off a played-out claim in the bad year of '93 and raised them in the warmth of my father's walls, and they are the reason there are people now who carry his hands forward without ever having known they were his. Captain lived 12 good years and is buried at the corner of the house where the south sun warms the ground first in the spring, and I have buried 3 dogs since in the same line, and the last of them, a brown one I called Captain again because some names are worth keeping, lies there yet. Dyer Holt died an old man who had spent his last 30 years building earth-banked houses for new families coming into a country that had learned hard what the winters could do. And he asked before he died to be buried where he could see the green roofs along the bench, and they did that for him. The house is still there. I am an old woman writing this in the warm back room my father taught me how to make, and the grass on my roof is the same grass that has grown there every spring for half a century, knit so deep now that the whole hill and the whole house are one living thing, and the cows' great-granddaughters graze it still. Children who were old themselves now were raised warm in these walls, and they have raised their own children warm in walls they learned to build from. Mine, and somewhere out past the rim, are houses banked into hillsides by people who never heard my name and never heard my father's, who only know that you lay the turf grass down to knit and grass up to grow, and that the stone gives back at night what the fire gave it by day. That is the whole of the inheritance, and it has outlived every man who laughed and will outlive me. The wind comes across thy benchland the way it always came, unhurried, certain it will be paid, and it goes over my turf roof the way water goes over a stone, finding no edge to lift and no corner to pry, and nothing, after all these years, to take. My father told me that earth is the slowest and the most faithful of all the things that hold a fire. He has been dead more than 60 years. The warmth he taught my hands to hold is in the stone behind me as I write this, given back out of the ground exactly as he said it would be, and it will be warm in this room on the night I die, and warm the night after, when the ground keeps on giving back what it was patient enough to take.